At 32, I received a medical diagnosis that completely shattered my world. I had stage 3 breast cancer. When I called my parents desperate for a lifeline, they told me my illness was an inconvenience to my brother's luxury wedding. After that, no one contacted me again. I went through the horrors of chemotherapy completely alone. 3 years later, I beat cancer. Last week, the father who abandoned me called me sobbing, asking me to take care of him. My answer to him was just 6 words, and it left him in absolute dead silence. My phone buzzed on the marble kitchen island. The caller ID flashed a number I had not seen in 3 years. Calvin, my father. Against my better judgment, I answered. Before I could even say hello, his hysterical sobs filled the receiver. He was hyperventilating, crying about how the bank was changing the locks on his front door right at that very moment. He and my mother Brenda were being evicted. He demanded I send a car to bring them to my townhouse. He told me he needed to move into my guest room immediately and that I needed to wire him money to cover his new heart medication because his insurance had lapsed. He spoke as if the last 3 years had never happened, as if I was still the obedient little workhorse daughter ready to drop everything to clean up their messes. I let him ramble until he ran out of breath. Then I asked him one question. You want the guest room? The same room you told me was far too nice for a sick person when I begged to come home after my first grueling round of chemotherapy. He stammered, trying to find an excuse, but I did not give him the chance. I took a deep breath and delivered the absolute truth. I died 3 years ago, Dad. I hung up the phone and blocked the number again. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Have you ever had to cut off the people who gave you life just to save your own? Hit the like button and subscribe, because you will not believe the absolute hell I had to walk through to finally say those 6 words. Your peace is always worth more than their approval. My name is Jada, and I am 35 years old. I stood in the center of my custom kitchen, letting the silence of my home wash over me. The afternoon sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine hardwood floors and the expensive modern art on the walls. This house in a high-end Atlanta suburb was my sanctuary. I bought it with my own money. I furnished it with my own money. I built this entire life from the ashes of the girl my family left behind to die. The audacity of my father to call me after leaving me for dead was staggering but not entirely surprising. To understand how we got to that phone call, you have to understand the dynamic of my family. I was always the scapegoat, and my older brother Jamal was the golden child. Growing up, Jamal could do no wrong. No. If he failed a class, my parents blamed the teacher. If he wrecked a car, my parents blamed the weather. Meanwhile, I was expected to be flawless. I worked 2 jobs in high school just to pay for my own college applications because my parents had drained my savings account to pay off a massive credit card debt Jamal racked up on a spring break trip. Whenever I tried to set a boundary, my mother Brenda would guilt-trip me. She would tell me that family takes care of family and that I needed to be a team player. But being a team player only ever meant sacrificing my needs for Jamal's desires. By the time I was 28, I had worked my way up the corporate ladder at a prestigious wealth management firm. I was a financial planner handling multi-million-dollar portfolios for high-net-worth clients. I was good at my job. I understood the language of money. I understood risk and return and long-term investments. Unfortunately, my family saw my career as their personal piggy bank. Jamal was 34 and chronically unemployed. He jumped from one failed startup idea to another, always convinced he was just one investment away from being a billionaire. And my parents funded every single delusion. They mortgaged their home. They dipped into their retirement funds. They enabled his reckless lifestyle while expecting me to foot the bill for their basic necessities. I was paying my parents' utility bills while Jamal was driving a luxury sports vehicle. I was the responsible one. The reliable one. The one who never asked for anything but was expected to give everything. Things escalated dramatically when Jamal got engaged to Nia. Nia was exactly like Jamal. She was entitled, arrogant, and obsessed with keeping up appearances on social media. She constantly made snide remarks about me being single, throwing my career in my face, as if my financial independence was some sort of tragic character flaw. They started planning a wedding that rivaled a royal coronation. It was a massive, expensive production that my family absolutely could not afford. My mother, Brenda, called me one evening completely frantic. She demanded I contribute $10,000 to the catering budget. She did not ask me if I could help. She demanded it. She told me it was my duty as a sister to ensure Jamal's special day was absolutely perfect. I was hesitant, but the lifelong toxic conditioning of seeking my parents' approval kicked in hard. I told her I would see what I could do and mentally started rearranging my savings to give them the money. I just wanted them to love me. I wanted them to look at me with the same pride and adoration they reserved for Jamal. But life has a funny way of waking you up when you are sleepwalking through toxic patterns. A few weeks after that financial demand, I started feeling unusually exhausted. I chalked it up to the severe stress of my job and the constant overwhelming demands from my family. I was working 60-hour weeks and managing the emotional weight of my parents' financial irresponsibility. But then the exhaustion turned into sharp physical pains. I noticed a lump. The sheer terror kept me away from the doctor for a few weeks, but eventually the pain became impossible to ignore. I remember sitting in the cold, sterile office of the oncologist like it was yesterday. The fluorescent lights buzzed loudly overhead, casting a pale glow over the room. The doctor walked in, and I could tell immediately by the look in her eyes that my life was about to change forever. She sat down across from me, folded her hands, and delivered the news that literally stops time. Stage 3, breast cancer. It was aggressive. She explained that I needed surgery and I needed to start a brutal regimen of chemotherapy immediately. The medical terms echoed in my ears like a distant siren. I was 32 years old, I was healthy, I ate well, I exercised every morning. I had my entire life ahead of me, and suddenly I was staring directly down the barrel of my own mortality. The drive home from the clinic was a complete blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. My vision was clouded with hot tears and absolute terror. All I wanted in that moment was my mother. All I wanted was my father to hold me and tell me we were going to fight this terrible disease together. I parked in my driveway and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. I dialed my parents' house. I needed them to tell me everything would be okay. I needed the family I had spent my entire adult life supporting to finally step up and support me. When Calvin answered the phone, I completely broke down. The strong, independent financial planner facade completely crumbled away. I was just a terrified little girl who needed her dad to save her. I sobbed into the receiver and told him the diagnosis. I told him it was stage 3. I told him how aggressive it was. I told him I was incredibly scared and that I needed them by my side. There was a pause on the other end of the line. A long, heavy pause that felt like an eternity. I waited, holding my breath for the words of comfort. I waited for the warmth of a parent's love. Instead, I heard my father let out a long, exasperated sigh. It was the exact sound he made when he was annoyed by a minor inconvenience like a flat tire or a long line at the grocery store. What he said next would fundamentally break my heart into pieces. It would completely destroy the illusion of family I had clung to my entire life. And it would set the stage for the most painful but necessary transformation of my entire existence. "We cannot deal with this right now, Jada. Your brother Jamal is incredibly busy planning his wedding." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I sat there in the driver's seat of my car with the engine turned off and the silence of the parking lot pressing in on me from all sides. I opened my mouth to speak, to scream, to beg him to understand, but the line shuffled. I heard the muffled sound of a hand placed over the receiver. I could hear brief, harsh whispers in the background. Then my mother Brenda took the phone. I braced myself. Even after what my father had just said, a tiny, pathetic part of me still hoped my mother would gasp. I hoped she would cry out and ask what the oncologist had said. I hoped she would tell me she was getting her coat and coming straight to my house. But her voice was crisp and strictly business. She did not ask about my prognosis. She did not ask about the survival rate. She did not even ask how I was feeling or if I was sitting down. She just cleared her throat and got straight to the point. Jada, listen to me. Since you are going to be resting a lot and probably taking time off work, you can still transfer the $10,000 you promised for Jamal's catering budget, right? We need to lock in the vendor by tomorrow afternoon, and Nia is very stressed out about the floral arrangements. The world actually stopped spinning. The air in my car suddenly felt too thick to breathe. My mother had just been told her daughter had stage 3 cancer, a disease that could very well put me in the ground before the end of the year, and her immediate reaction was to secure the funding for her son's extravagant party. It was a level of emotional depravity I could not even comprehend. I swallowed hard, tasting the salt of my own tears. Mom, I have cancer. It is stage 3. I am going to need surgery. I am going to need chemotherapy. I am going to have massive medical bills and I will not be able to work at full capacity for months. I cannot give you $10,000. I need every single penny I have just to survive this. The temperature of her voice dropped to absolute zero. She let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. It was the exact same laugh she used when I was a teenager and told her I wanted to go to an out-of-state college. The laugh that meant my ambitions or my problems were entirely insignificant. Oh, please, Jada, stop being so dramatic. You always do this. You always find a way to make everything about you when it is Jamal's time to shine. It is just a little health scare. You are young. You will be fine. But you promised us that money. You gave us your word, and your brother is counting on you. I could not believe what I was hearing. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my hands cramped. I am not being dramatic, Mom. The doctor just gave me the diagnosis 10 minutes ago. I am fighting for my life. My mother sighed loudly, a sound of pure irritation. You know what, Jada? I am not going to let you ruin this week for us. Nia has her bridal shower this weekend, and Jamal is under a lot of pressure. If you are going to use this little health hiccup as an excuse to be selfish and back out of your financial obligations to this family, then I do not want to hear it. Call me back when you are ready to be a supportive sister. Until then, do not stress out your brother with this nonsense. The line went dead. A hollow beep echoed through the Bluetooth speakers of my car. I slowly lowered the phone. The sun was still shining outside. People were still walking to their cars holding coffee cups and chatting. The world was still moving, but my entire reality had just been permanently altered. I was completely alone. The screen of my phone went black, but a moment later it lit up again with a rapid succession of text messages. It was Jamal. My mother had clearly just called him to complain about my refusal to hand over my savings. The messages flooded in one after another, relentless and cruel. Mom just told me you are trying to back out of paying for the catering. Are you kidding me right now? You make 6 figures, Jada. Stop being so cheap. Nia is crying because we might have to downgrade the cocktail menu and it is going to look embarrassing. You are always trying to ruin my happiness. Pay up or do not bother showing your face at my wedding. I stared at the bright screen. My hands were violently shaking. I opened my photo gallery and selected the picture of the chemotherapy schedule the oncologist had just handed me. The document detailed the brutal months ahead. The surgeries, the radiation, the toxic chemicals that would be pumped into my veins to kill the disease inside me. I attached the image and sent it to Jamal with a single sentence. I have stage 3 cancer, and I need a ride to the hospital on Tuesday for my first treatment. I watched the screen. I saw the little indicator show that the message was delivered. Then the read receipt appeared beneath my text. He saw it. He opened it. He read the words and looked at the hospital document. And then nothing. The 3 little typing dots never appeared. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then an hour. He left me on red. My own brother read that I was fighting a deadly disease, and his only response was absolute silence because I would not buy him a luxury dinner for his wedding guests. The entire family effectively ghosted me that afternoon. They formed a united front of silent treatment, punishing me for prioritizing my own survival over a party. That was the moment the last remaining thread connecting me to my family finally snapped. I put my car in gear and drove away from the clinic. I did not drive to my parents' house. I drove back to my empty townhouse. I walked through the front door and locked the deadbolt behind me. The silence of my home was heavy. It was a stark reminder of my isolation. But as I sat on my living room floor, crying until my throat was raw and my eyes burned, a new feeling began to take root beneath the suffocating grief. It was anger. A cold, sharp, calculating anger. Over the next few weeks, I endured my first rounds of chemotherapy entirely alone. The physical toll was brutal. I spent nights shivering on my bathroom floor, too weak to stand up to get a glass of water. My hair started falling out in clumps. My skin lost its color. Every joint in my body ached as the medicine ravaged my system to save my life. And while I was vomiting in a hospital plastic basin, my phone would occasionally light up with social media notifications. I would look at the screen and see my parents checking into a luxury bridal shower for Nia. I saw photos of Jamal popping expensive champagne. I saw my mother smiling brightly in expensive new dresses. They were spending thousands of dollars celebrating, while I was fighting for my next breath across town. I realized then that my family was not just oblivious. They were actively choosing to ignore my mortality. They had weighed my life against a wedding aesthetic and decided I was not worth the trouble. The grief of losing my family finally eclipsed the fear of the cancer. I stopped crying over them. I stopped waiting for the phone to ring. I focused every ounce of my fading energy on surviving. But there was one final humiliation I had to endure before I could completely cut the cord. Months later, when I was bald, exhausted, but finally seeing a glimmer of hope in my test results, the wedding day arrived. Against the advice of my oncology nurse, I decided to show my face at the venue. I wanted to look them in the eye. I wanted them to see what they had abandoned. I put on a beautiful silk headwrap, a tailored dress that hung loosely on my thinned frame, and drove to the luxury hotel downtown. I walked into the grand lobby, my heart pounding against my ribs. The room was filled with flowers and crystal chandeliers. But before I could even reach the ballroom doors, two figures stepped into my path: Nia and my mother, Brenda. Nia was in her extravagant white gown. She looked me up and down, her face contorting into a mask of pure disgust. She did not ask how I was doing. She crossed her arms and glared at my head wrap. "You cannot be here looking like that, Jada. You are going to ruin the aesthetic of the wedding photos, looking so sickly. It is depressing, and it is going to bring down the mood of my entire day." Before I could even process the cruelty of her words, my mother stepped forward. She did not offer me a hug. She did not offer me a seat. She reached out, grabbed the coat I was holding over my arm, and forcefully shoved it into my chest. "Go home, Jada. You look terrible. Do not stress out the bride today of all days. We will call you when this is all over." I stood there holding my coat. The loud music from the ballroom echoed down the hallway. I looked at my mother, and I looked at the woman my brother was marrying. I did not argue. I did not cause a scene. I simply turned around and walked back out through the revolving glass doors. I stood in the freezing parking lot alone. I did not scream. I did not beg. The realization hit me with absolute crystal clarity. Sitting in my cold car, I pulled out my phone. I went into my contacts and I blocked Calvin. I blocked Brenda. I blocked Jamal. I blocked Nia. I blocked every single aunt, uncle, and cousin who had liked their photos while ignoring my existence. I made a silent vow to the universe that I was going to survive. I was going to beat the cancer. I was going to build an empire. and the desperate daughter who had begged them for scraps of love officially died in that parking lot. The days that followed that silent vow in the hotel parking lot were some of the darkest and most defining of my life. I went through the remainder of my chemotherapy and radiation treatments in absolute solitude. There were nights when the pain was so severe I could not stand up to reach the glass of water on my nightstand. I would lie on the cool bathroom floor sweating and shivering, while the poison pumped through my veins fought the cancer cells for control of my body. During those agonizing hours, I did not think about my mother. I did not think about my father. I did not think about Jamal or his extravagant wedding. I thought only of survival. The oncology nurses became my surrogate family. A nurse named Jackson, who had been holding my hand during every single infusion, became the person I listed as my emergency contact. When my hair completely fell out, Jackson brought me a collection of beautiful silk wraps and helped me tie them. When I was too weak to drive myself home from the clinic, the hospital arranged transportation. I learned that family is not a biological default. Family is a verb. It is the people who show up for you when you have absolutely nothing left to offer them in return. 6 months after the wedding incident, I sat in the same sterile doctor's office where my nightmare had begun. The fluorescent lights still buzzed overhead, but this time the oncologist had a smile on her face. She looked at my scans and then looked at me. Remission. The word hung in the air like a pure golden light. The cancer was gone. I had fought the hardest battle of my life entirely on my own, and I had won. The moment I walked out of that clinic, a profound shift happened inside me. The fear was gone. The desperate need for my parents' validation was gone. All that remained was a fierce, unstoppable drive. I took all the energy, all the pain, and all the anger from the past year and funneled it directly into my career. I left the wealth management firm I was working for and launched my own independent financial planning agency. I worked 80-hour weeks. I aggressively networked. I built a roster of high-net-worth clients who trusted my sharp instincts and my uncompromising dedication. My business exploded. Within 2 years, my firm was managing hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. I hired a brilliant team. I bought a stunning ultra-modern townhouse in one of the most exclusive suburbs of Atlanta. I decorated it with expensive art plush furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the warm southern sunlight. I created a sanctuary where toxic people were permanently denied entry. I was completely self-made, physically healed, and financially bulletproof. I never checked on my family. I never unblocked their phone numbers. I never searched for them on social media. As far as I was concerned, the people who left me to die no longer existed on this earth. Then came my 35th birthday, which also marked my official 3-year cancer-free milestone. I threw a massive celebration at my new home. The house was filled with laughter music and the scent of expensive catered food. My chosen family was there. Nurse Jackson was drinking champagne by the kitchen island. My loyal friends from the industry were laughing on the patio. My incredibly supportive new partner was holding my hand and toasting to my health. It was a scene of pure joy and genuine love. But the universe has a very funny way of delivering karma. During the party, an older family friend named Miss Loretta, who I had kept in touch with, pulled me aside. She had always been kind to me, and she could not hold back the gossip any longer. She lowered her voice and told me that the golden house of cards my parents had built for Jamal had completely collapsed. The economic reality of my brother's reckless lifestyle had finally caught up with him. Jamal had launched another foolish tech startup using borrowed money, and it had crashed and burned spectacularly. When the money ran out, the facade of his perfect marriage shattered right along with it. Naya, realizing that the luxury vacations and designer bags were being funded by high-interest debt, abruptly filed for divorce. She hired a ruthless lawyer and took half of whatever assets were left, leaving Jamal with nothing but a mountain of liabilities. But the destruction did not stop with Jamal. Miss Loretta took a sip of her wine and shook her head sadly. She told me that Calvin and Brenda, my parents, had secretly co-signed on Jamal's massive business loans. They had heavily mortgaged their own home to pay for his extravagant wedding and to keep his business afloat. When Jamal's company went under, the creditors came looking for the guarantors. My parents were completely wiped out. The bank had initiated foreclosure on their home. The luxury cars were repossessed. They had absolutely nothing left. I stood in my beautiful kitchen, listening to the story of their ruin. I did not smile, but I did not feel an ounce of pity either. I felt completely neutral. I thanked Miss Loretta for the information, changed the subject, and went back to celebrating my beautiful life. But I knew the peace would not last. Desperation breeds audacity. Word of my massive success, my new firm and my wealthy lifestyle had finally reached the bankrupt side of my family. Suddenly, the people who abandoned me in a cancer ward needed a savior. The attempts to breach my boundaries started slowly, and then escalated into sheer panic. They tried to call my personal phone, but the numbers were still permanently blocked. Then the emails started coming to my professional work address. My executive assistant, Monique, is a fierce gatekeeper. I gave her explicit instructions regarding the names Calvin, Brenda, and Jamal. Any email containing those names was instantly routed to a hidden spam folder that was deleted every Friday. I never even saw the messages. When the emails did not work, they resorted to ambushes. I was in the middle of a video conference with a major client when Monique knocked on my glass office door. She stepped inside looking annoyed. She told me that a woman claiming to be my Aunt Denise was standing in the lobby making a scene and demanding to see me immediately. I knew exactly what this was. They had sent a flying monkey to guilt-trip me. I muted my microphone and looked at Monique. I told her to send building security to the lobby. I told her to have the woman escorted off the premises and to inform the front desk that no one from my biological family was permitted past the ground floor under any circumstances. 10 minutes later, Monique returned and gave me a thumbs up. Aunt Denise had been physically walked out of the building by two large security guards while screaming about family loyalty in front of dozens of corporate employees. The message was sent loud and clear. My boundaries were made of steel and I would not be manipulated. But my father Calvin and my brother Jamal were too desperate and too arrogant to take the hint. They actually believed that if they pushed hard enough, the obedient little scapegoat would magically reappear and hand over her checkbook. They completely underestimated the woman I had become. They did not realize that I was no longer playing defense. As a financial genius and the head of an aggressive wealth management firm, I had access to information and resources they could not even fathom. My firm had recently started purchasing distressed debt portfolios from local banks as part of a new investment strategy. It was a highly profitable venture where we bought defaulted loans for pennies on the dollar and managed the collection or liquidation process. When Miss Loretta told me about my parents' foreclosure, my mind immediately went to work. I did not just want to block them out of my life. I wanted to ensure they could never threaten my peace again. I wanted complete leverage. I made a few discreet phone calls to my contacts in the banking sector. I tracked down the specific commercial bank that held the mortgage on Calvin and Brenda's house and the bank that held the liens on Jamal's repossessed assets. Through my firm, I systematically and legally acquired those specific debt bundles. I bought the paper on their ruined lives. I did not do it out of malice. I did it because it was a sound financial investment and because it gave me absolute control over the narrative. I did not just know they were broke. I literally owned their debt. I held the keys to their eviction. And I kept that devastating secret weapon securely locked in my briefcase, waiting for the exact moment they decided to push me too far. I did not have to wait long. 2 days after Aunt Denise was thrown out of my lobby, the ultimate confrontation arrived. And it happened in the most public, humiliating way possible, until I was ready to stop playing the victim and write the check. The line went completely dead. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear and stared at the dark screen. The silence in my kitchen was deafening. I had just told my mother that I was facing a life-threatening illness, and her only concern was the catering budget for a party. I sank down onto the cold hardwood floor of my living room, pulling my knees to my chest. The gravity of the diagnosis had been terrifying enough, but the sudden absolute realization that my own flesh and blood did not care whether I lived or died was a different kind of agony. It was a deep, suffocating ache that settled directly in my chest. Before I could even process the tears that were starting to blur my vision, my phone vibrated in my hand. Then it vibrated again and again. A rapid-fire succession of text messages began lighting up the screen. I wiped my eyes and looked at the notifications. It was Jamal. My mother had clearly just hung up with me and immediately dialed her golden child to complain about my insubordination. I opened the text thread. I expected maybe a question about the diagnosis. A tiny sliver of brotherly concern buried beneath his usual arrogance. I was incredibly naive. Are you seriously trying to sabotage my wedding right now? Mom just called me crying. She said you are refusing to transfer the 10 grand we agreed on for the catering deposit. What is your problem, Jada? You know my crypto investments are completely tied up right now, and Nia has her heart set on the imported orchids and the raw seafood bar. Do not try to use some minor health scare as an excuse to be cheap. You make 6 figures. You literally sit at a desk all day. Stop being selfish and wire the money. Nia is incredibly stressed out and you are ruining our entire vibe. I stared at the messages. The sheer delusional audacity of his words made my blood run cold. Jamal was 34 years old. He had not held a steady paycheck in over 5 years. He jumped from one failed venture to the next, always convinced he was the smartest man in the room. He tried to be a club promoter. He tried to launch a podcast. He bought a course on real estate wholesaling and quit after 2 weeks. Every single time he failed, my parents stepped in to cushion his fall. They paid his rent. They paid his car note. And now he was marrying Nia, a woman whose entire personality was based on projecting a luxury lifestyle she could not afford. This wedding was not a celebration of love. It was a theatrical production designed to make Jamal and Nia look like high society royalty. And they fully expected me to fund their delusions while I was quite literally fighting for my life. My hands were shaking, but the profound sadness was slowly starting to curdle into sharp, hot anger. I typed my response carefully. Jamal. I do not have a minor health scare. I was just diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. It is highly aggressive. I am going to be out of work for an extended period of time to undergo chemotherapy and surgery. I am fighting for my life. I cannot afford a $10,000 raw seafood bar. Please tell me you understand this. I watched the screen. The 3 little typing dots appeared almost immediately. He did not pause to think. He did not pause to process the fact that his little sister had cancer. Yeah, Mom mentioned you went to the doctor, but you always overreact. You do not need to make it my problem. You have great health insurance. 10 grand is nothing to you and you promised. Nia says you are just doing this because you are jealous. You are 32 and single and you cannot stand to see me happy. Just send the money, Jada. We need to lock in the vendor by 5. He was demanding $10,000 while accusing me of being a bitter spinster. I looked around my beautiful home, the home I had purchased with my own blood, sweat, and tears. I looked at the medical brochures the oncologist had handed me sitting on the kitchen counter. Pamphlets about hair loss, port flushes, managing severe nausea, white blood cell counts. I was looking down the barrel of months of physical torture and my brother was worried about imported orchids. I did not want to argue anymore. I wanted to force reality right into his hands. I got up from the floor, walked over to the kitchen counter, and picked up my official treatment schedule. The document had the hospital logo at the top. It clearly stated Stage 3 Oncology Unit. Below that was a terrifying calendar of aggressive intravenous chemotherapy infusions scheduled multiple times a week. I laid the document flat on the marble counter and took a clear, high-resolution photo of it. I attached the image to our text thread. I did not hurl insults. I did not scream. I stripped away all my pride and sent him a message of pure, raw vulnerability. I am not jealous, Jamal. I am dying. Look at that paper. I am terrified. I need a ride to the hospital this coming Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. for my first port placement and infusion. I cannot drive myself home afterward because of the heavy medication. Please, I am begging you. Be my brother. Come pick me up on Tuesday. I hit send. The green bar loaded across the top of the screen. Delivered. I sat there and stared at the digital timestamp. It was exactly 4:12 in the afternoon. I watched the bottom of the screen waiting for the word read to appear. A minute passed. Then two. Finally, the tiny text shifted. Read at 4:14 p.m. He saw it. He opened the photo. He read my desperate plea for help. He saw the cold, hard medical proof that my life was in jeopardy. I waited for the typing dots. I waited for him to call. I waited for the sudden realization to hit him that this was not a game. I sat on that kitchen stool for 3 hours. The sun slowly set, casting long, dark shadows across my living room. The typing dots never appeared. My phone never rang. Jamal left me on read. He did not reply that night. He did not reply the next day. The silence was absolute and suffocating. But the betrayal did not stop with him. The next morning, I opened my social media out of sheer habit. The first thing that popped up on my feed was a lengthy status update from my mother, Brenda. It breaks my heart when toxic family members try to ruin your blessings. Sometimes you have to protect your peace and cut off the people who refuse to support your happiness. So incredibly proud of my son Jamal and my future daughter-in-law Naya. We will not let anyone dim your light. Dozens of extended family members had liked and commented on the post. Aunts and cousins leaving heart emojis and telling my mother how strong she was. None of them called me. None of them asked for my side of the story. The entire family had rallied around Jamal and completely ghosted me. They were actively punishing me for prioritizing my survival over their aesthetic. The weekend crawled by in a blur of numb disbelief. I packed a small hospital bag. I bought ginger ale and crackers to prepare for the nausea. I did everything entirely alone. When Tuesday morning finally arrived, my alarm went off at 4:30. The house was pitch black and freezing cold. I got out of bed, my stomach churning with anxiety. I took a shower, dressed in loose, comfortable clothing, and went downstairs. I stood by the large window in my living room, looking out at the dark, empty street. Part of me, the broken inner child who still desperately craved her family, held onto a tiny sliver of hope. I thought maybe, just maybe, I would see Jamal's car pull around the corner. I thought maybe my father would show up. Maybe they had just been angry and needed the weekend to cool off. Maybe they would realize I was their blood and they could not let me walk into a cancer ward alone. I stood by that window until 5:45. The streetlights flickered and died as the early morning dawn began to wash the sky in a pale gray light. No cars turned onto my street. My driveway remained completely empty. My phone screen stayed dark. They really were not coming. I let out a long, trembling breath. I pulled up a rideshare app on my phone and ordered a car to take me to the hospital. When the driver pulled up, I locked my front door and walked out into the cold morning air. I climbed into the back seat of a stranger's car to go fight for my life. As I watched my neighborhood roll by through the tinted window, the last remaining threads of my loyalty to my family completely dissolved. They had made their choice. Now, I had to make mine. The sliding glass doors of the oncology wing opened with a quiet mechanical hum, pulling me into a world I was entirely unprepared for. The smell of strong antiseptic and sterile floor wax hit me instantly, making my already nervous stomach turn. I walked up to the reception desk, my hospital bag slung over my shoulder, feeling like a child reporting for a punishment. The receptionist handed me a clipboard with a stack of intake forms. When I reached the section that asked for an emergency contact and a designated medical proxy, my pen hovered over the paper. For my entire adult life, I had listed my mother or my father in those blank spaces. Today I stared at the empty boxes and realized with a sickening drop in my chest that I had absolutely no one to write down. I left the lines blank and handed the clipboard back. The receptionist gave me a sympathetic look that told me she understood exactly what that blank space meant. A few minutes later, a kind older nurse named Jackson called my name and led me back into the treatment area. The room was lined with large leather recliner chairs separated by thin privacy curtains. As I walked down the aisle to my assigned seat, I looked around at the other patients. Every single one of them had somebody by their side. I saw a husband gently rubbing his wife's bald head. I saw a daughter holding a cup of ice chips for her frail mother. I saw friends sitting in visitor chairs reading magazines out loud to pass the time. And then there was me. 32 years old, successful, independent, and sitting completely alone in a cold leather chair, while a machine prepared to pump toxic chemicals into my chest. Nurse Jackson was incredibly gentle as she prepped me for the procedure. She explained every step of the port placement and the intravenous infusion that would follow. She did not ask me where my family was. She simply held my hand for a brief moment before she started the IV line. The fluid entering my veins felt like ice water. Within 20 minutes, the reality of the chemotherapy began to take over my body. A strong metallic taste flooded the back of my throat. My vision blurred slightly, and a deep, heavy ache settled right into the marrow of my bones. It was not a gradual sickness. It was a violent, hostile takeover of my physical system. By the second hour, I was hunched over a pink plastic hospital basin, violently throwing up everything I had tried to eat that morning. Cold sweat poured down my neck and soaked through the collar of my shirt. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep my grip on the edge of the basin. I closed my eyes, praying for the nausea to pass just for a minute so I could catch my breath. The physical toll was brutal and relentless. Right as another wave of sickness crashed over me, my phone began to buzz wildly on the small metal side table next to my chair. The screen lit up with a rapid succession of notifications. In my feverish, exhausted state, a pathetic spark of hope flared in my chest. I thought maybe my father had finally felt a pang of guilt. Maybe my mother had called to check on me. Maybe Jamal had realized the gravity of what I was going through. My hands trembled as I reached out and grabbed the device. But it was not a text message checking on my well-being. It was a flood of social media alerts. Because we had many mutual friends, my feed was instantly populated with photos and live videos from a location tagged at the most exclusive country club in the city. I wiped my mouth with a tissue and stared at the bright screen. There was my mother Brenda wearing a custom-tailored silk dress, standing next to Nia, who was draped in a designer white jumpsuit. They were standing in front of a massive imported floral wall, holding crystal flutes of expensive pink champagne. The next photo showed a sprawling mimosa bar, a towering display of gourmet pastries, and tables covered in custom silk gift bags for the guests. I swiped through the images, my heart pounding against my ribs. There was a video of Jamal walking into the room to surprise his bride-to-be. Everyone was cheering and clapping. My father Calvin was in the background laughing loudly and raising his glass for a toast. The caption on my mother's post read, "Treating the future bride to the luxury she deserves. Family over everything. We spare no expense for the people we love." I looked at the photos of the floral wall. I looked at the crystal glasses. I looked at the designer clothes. I did the math in my head. That bridal shower alone cost well over $15,000. They had the money. They always had the money when it came to Jamal. They had simply decided that my life was not worth the investment. I sat back in the leather recliner, the hospital monitors beeping rhythmically around me. The nausea in my stomach was suddenly eclipsed by a profound emotional sickness. My family was not just oblivious to my suffering. They were not just busy. They were actively, willingly choosing to ignore my mortality. They knew I was sitting in a hospital chair with poison dripping into my veins, fighting for a chance to see my 33rd birthday. And they did not care. A strange stillness washed over me. It was the absolute silence of a completely broken heart. For 32 years, I had contorted myself into whatever shape my parents needed me to be just to earn a fraction of the love they showered freely on my brother. I had paid their bills. I had sacrificed my own peace. I had played the role of the reliable, quiet workhorse. But staring at that picture of my mother, smiling, holding a glass of champagne, while I was throwing up bile into a plastic bowl, the illusion finally shattered. The grief of losing my family hit me harder than the fear of the cancer. The cancer was a biological disease attacking my cells. But the betrayal of my parents was a spiritual violence that destroyed the very foundation of who I thought I was. I realized in that sterile room that I was an orphan. I had living parents, but I did not have a mother or a father. I had a brother who shared my DNA, but I did not have a sibling. I set the phone face down on the metal table. I did not cry out. I did not text them to ruin their party. I let the tears fall silently down my cheeks, mourning the death of the family I never truly had. I cried for the little girl who had tried so hard to be good enough. And when there were no more tears left to cry, something cold and indestructible solidified in my chest. Nurse Jackson walked over to check my vitals. She saw the tears on my face and gently handed me a fresh towel. She asked me if I needed anything for the pain. I looked up at her, my vision clear and my voice entirely steady, despite the violent shaking of my hands. I told her I was going to be fine. I told her I was going to beat this disease, and I was going to live a very long and very successful life. The shift had happened. The victim inside me was gone. My family had left me in the dark, expecting me to quietly fade away so they could continue their glamorous delusion without the inconvenience of a sick daughter. But I was not going to fade away. I was going to survive. I was going to build an empire of my own, and I was going to make absolutely certain that none of them would ever be allowed to stand in my light again. The next 4 months of my life were a masterclass in human endurance. Chemotherapy is not just a medical treatment. It is a war waged inside your own veins. I lost my hair by the second month. It started falling out in heavy clumps on my pillow and clogging the drain in my shower until I finally took a pair of clippers and shaved it all off. I lost 20 pounds I could not afford to lose. My skin took on a fragile gray tone, and my energy levels plummeted so low that simply walking up the stairs in my townhouse felt like climbing a mountain. I was fighting a brutal, invisible battle entirely on my own. My parents and my brother never called. They never texted to ask about my scans. They were entirely consumed by the spectacle of Jamal's upcoming wedding. Despite the deafening silence from my family, a toxic, deeply ingrained sense of obligation still clung to me. Trauma bonding is an incredibly powerful anchor when you spend your entire life being conditioned to chase the approval of people who do not value you. It is very hard to break the habit even when you are dying. As the wedding day approached, my oncology nurse Jackson strongly advised me to stay home. My white blood cell count was dangerously low, and the stress was toxic to my recovery. But the broken little girl inside of me thought that if I just showed up, if I just put on a brave face and brought a beautiful gift, they would finally see me. I thought that standing in the same room with them would magically remind my parents that they had a daughter who loved them. I was so incredibly wrong. The morning of the wedding, I spent 3 hours trying to make myself look acceptable. I did not want to look sick. I did not want to be a burden or a distraction. I carefully applied makeup to bring some color back to my sunken cheeks. I put on a stunning emerald green silk dress that draped elegantly over my frail frame, hiding the severe weight loss. Nurse Jackson had gifted me a beautiful gold and green silk head wrap to cover my bald head. I tied it carefully, making sure it looked intentional and regal rather than medical. I looked in the mirror and took a deep breath. I looked different, but I looked dignified. I picked up the expensive crystal vase I had bought from their registry, walked out to my car, and drove downtown. The wedding was being held at one of the most exclusive luxury hotels in the city. The kind of venue where the valet parks your car and the floors are made of imported Italian marble. As I handed my keys to the attendant, my stomach churned with a mixture of heavy medication and severe anxiety. I walked through the towering glass doors and into the grand lobby. The sheer scale of the extravagance was nauseating. There were massive floral arrangements of white roses and orchids at every corner. A string quartet was playing classical music near the grand staircase. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos were already circling with trays of expensive champagne. I knew my parents did not have the money for this. I knew they were drowning in debt to fund this illusion of royalty for Jamal and Nia, and yet they had demanded my life savings to add to the pile. I took a slow, shaky breath and made my way down the long, heavily carpeted corridor that led to the main ballroom. My legs felt heavy, and every step required a conscious effort. I held the wrapped gift box tightly against my chest like a shield. I could hear the sounds of laughter and the clinking of glasses echoing from the open doors at the end of the hall. For a brief, foolish second, I pictured myself walking into the room. I pictured Jamal coming over to hug me. I pictured my father smiling. But I never even made it to the doors. About 50 feet from the entrance, the heavy oak doors of a private bridal suite swung open. Out stepped Nia. She was flanked by 2 makeup artists and a photographer. She was wearing a custom couture white gown covered in thousands of hand-sewn crystals. The dress was massive, taking up almost the entire width of the hallway. Right behind her, holding the train of the dress, was my mother Brenda. Brenda was wearing a custom silver gown that looked like it cost more than my first car. They were laughing about something the photographer had said, but the moment Nia turned her head and made eye contact with me, the laughter abruptly stopped. The smile vanished from her face, completely replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated disgust. She stopped walking, causing the photographer to bump into her. My mother looked up from the train of the dress and froze. I stood there in the middle of the hallway holding my gift. I offered a small, hesitant smile. I told them they looked beautiful. I told them I just wanted to come and drop off my gift and congratulate Jamal before the ceremony started. I kept my voice soft and polite. I did not want to cause a scene. I just wanted to exist in my family's presence for 5 minutes. Nia did not return the smile. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering harshly on the gold silk head wrap covering my bald head. She let out a sharp scoff of disbelief and crossed her arms over her crystal-covered bodice. "What are you doing here, Jada? You were supposed to send the gift in the mail." Her voice was cold and loud, echoing off the marble walls. The photographer and the makeup artist awkwardly looked down at the floor, realizing they had just stepped into a very tense family situation. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat and stepped forward slightly. I told her, "I am your sister-in-law, Nia. I wanted to be here to celebrate with you and Jamal. I am feeling a little better today, and I wanted to see my family." Nia rolled her eyes heavily. She did not lower her voice. She did not care who was listening. "Look at yourself, Jada. You cannot be here looking like that. You are going to ruin the aesthetic of the wedding photos, looking so sickly. It is depressing. People are going to be asking questions about you all night instead of focusing on me. This is my day, my perfect day. And you showing up looking like a cancer patient is going to completely bring down the mood of the entire event." The cruelty of her words felt like a physical slap to the face. She did not even see me as a human being fighting for my life. She saw me as a depressing prop that clashed with her color scheme. My eyes immediately darted to my mother. I looked at Brenda, waiting for the maternal instinct to finally kick in. I waited for my mother to reprimand Nia. I waited for her to step forward and tell her new daughter-in-law that she could not speak to her sick child that way. Brenda let go of the bridal train and walked toward me. But her face was not soft with pity. Her jaw was clenched tight with pure annoyance. She walked right up to my face and looked at me with the exact same disgust Nia had just displayed. "I told you on the phone months ago, Jada. If you could not be a supportive sister and contribute to the wedding, you did not need to come. Why would you show up here and cause drama?" I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, completely paralyzed by the absolute lack of humanity in her eyes. I whispered that I was not causing drama. I told her I just wanted to drop off the gift. I told her I was tired and I was sick and I just wanted to see my brother. Brenda did not care. She reached out and snatched the beautifully wrapped gift box right out of my hands. She tossed it onto a nearby decorative table without even looking at it. Then she reached out and physically grabbed the lapels of my winter coat, which was draped over my arm. With a sudden aggressive motion, she shoved the heavy wool coat directly into my chest. The impact forced me to take a step backward, my weak legs trembling under the sudden shift in weight. Go home, Jada. You look terrible. Do not stress out the bride today of all days. We have VIP guests arriving in 10 minutes, and I will not have you standing around the lobby looking like a tragedy. Jamal does not want to see you. Go home. We will call you when this is all over. She turned her back on me immediately. She walked back to Nia, picked up the train of the crystal gown, and offered the photographer a bright artificial smile. She told them to continue down the hall, completely ignoring the fact that she had just physically pushed her dying daughter away. I stood there alone in the corridor, clutching my winter coat to my chest. The string quartet was still playing a beautiful symphony in the lobby. The scent of imported white roses was thick and suffocating in the air. The reality of the situation crashed over me with the weight of a collapsing building. They were never going to change. They were never going to love me. My mother had just physically assaulted a cancer patient to protect the aesthetic of a party she could not even afford. The humiliation burned through my veins hotter than the chemotherapy drugs. But the tears did not fall. I was far too exhausted and far too broken to cry over them anymore. The desperate longing for a mother to stroke my hair and a father to protect me evaporated entirely in that luxurious hallway. It was replaced by a cold, hollow void. I did not say another word. I did not raise my voice or throw a tantrum. I simply turned around on the thick carpet and began the long walk back toward the grand lobby. With every step I took away from the ballroom, the invisible chains of family obligations snapped and fell away. By the time I reached the revolving glass doors at the front of the hotel, I felt lighter than I had in my entire life. I walked out into the freezing afternoon air and handed my ticket to the valet attendant. I was done trying to salvage a family that wanted me dead. The valet pulled my car up to the curb, leaving the engine running. The cold wind bit at my face. As I tipped, the young man climbed into the driver's seat and pulled the heavy door shut. The sudden absolute silence of the car's interior was a stark contrast to the distant muffled thumping of the wedding reception bass that echoed through the hotel walls. I sat there with both hands gripping the leather steering wheel, staring blankly at the brick facade of the luxury building. I waited for the familiar wave of crushing anxiety to hit me. I waited for the hot tears to blur my vision. I waited for the desperate, pathetic urge to run back inside, apologize for my existence, and beg for a seat in the back corner of their ballroom. But none of those things happened. Instead, a profound and absolute clarity washed over me. It was as if a thick, heavy fog that had clouded my brain for 32 years was instantly blown away by the freezing winter wind. I realized in that quiet moment that I had spent my entire life trying to buy love from morally bankrupt people. My parents did not hate me because I was inherently unlovable. They discarded me because I was no longer a convenient resource. My cancer was an inconvenience to their delusion of grandeur. I had always been the workhorse, the reliable bank account, the silent supporter. The exact moment I needed support, my value to them dropped to absolute zero. I reached into my purse and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim light of the parking lot. I unlocked it and opened my contacts list. For years, I had kept these numbers starred and pinned to the top of my messages, always terrified of missing an emergency call from them. Not anymore. I tapped on my father's name, Calvin, the man who sighed in severe annoyance when I told him I was fighting a deadly disease. I hit the block contact button. A small confirmation window popped up on the screen. I pressed confirm without a single hesitation. Next was Brenda, the woman who physically shoved a cancer patient in a hallway to protect a crystal gown. Block contact. Confirm. Then Jamal, the golden child who could not even be bothered to read a text message about his sister's chemotherapy schedule because he was too worried about imported floral arrangements. Block contact, confirm. I did not stop there. I opened my social media applications. I went through my friends list with the cold precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. Nia. Blocked. Aunt Denise, who always parroted my mother's toxic talking points. Blocked. Cousin Terrence, who liked every photo of the extravagant bridal shower but never once sent a text to ask if I was surviving my treatments. Blocked. I severed the digital ties one by one. I completely erased their access to my life. I was treating the biological cancer in my body with chemotherapy, but right there in that freezing parking lot, I was performing my own life-saving surgery. I was excising the toxic family tumor that had been draining my spirit since childhood. By the time I locked my phone screen, I had effectively made myself an orphan. And it was the most empowering decision I had ever made. I adjusted the rearview mirror and looked directly into my own eyes. The physical toll of the illness was undeniable. My cheekbones were sharp from the severe weight loss, my skin was pale and fragile. The gold silk head wrap concealed the fact that I had lost every single strand of my hair. But beneath the physical frailty, my eyes were entirely different. The sad, desperate little girl who just wanted her mother to stroke her hair and her father to protect her was gone. She officially took her last breath in the shadow of that luxury hotel. In her place was a woman who had walked through hell completely alone and discovered she was fireproof. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the hotel parking lot. I did not look back at the building in the rearview mirror. I turned onto the highway and merged into the evening traffic. The sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant orange and purple glow across the Atlanta skyline. For the first time since my terrible diagnosis, I did not feel terrified of the future. The fear of dying had been entirely replaced by a fierce burning desire to truly live. I drove back to my quiet townhouse, but as I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the space no longer felt like an empty tomb. It felt like a fortress. Over the next few days, the physical aftermath of attending the wedding hit my weakened immune system hard. I spent the weekend battling severe fatigue and bone-deep aches, but my mind had never been sharper. I stopped looking at my phone, hoping for a miracle apology. I threw away the framed family photos that used to sit on my living room mantel. I packed up every childhood memento, every birthday card, and every token of their conditional affection into a black trash bag and left it on the curb for the sanitation truck. I purged my home just as I had purged my contact list. When Tuesday rolled around, I ordered my rideshare and returned to the oncology clinic for my next round of intravenous poison. Nurse Jackson greeted me with her usual warm smile, but she noticed the change in my demeanor immediately. I was not the shrinking, terrified woman she had met months ago. I sat down in the leather recliner, rolled up my sleeve, and watched the medication flow into my port. I was ready for the fight. I made a silent vow to the universe right there in the treatment chair. I promised myself that I was not just going to survive this disease. I was going to conquer my entire reality. I was going to build an empire so massive and so undeniable that my success would echo in the rooms my family could never afford to enter. I realized that my financial planning career was my greatest weapon. I had spent years managing money for other people, playing it safe and working within the confines of a corporate firm. But surviving cancer and surviving my family had completely eliminated my fear of taking risks. While the chemicals dripped into my veins, I pulled out my tablet and started drafting a business plan. I was going to leave my corporate job. I was going to start my own independent wealth management agency. I knew the market. I knew the high net worth clients who trusted my sharp instincts. I had the knowledge and the sheer force of will to make it happen. My family had always used money as a tool of manipulation. My parents funded Jamal's constant failures to keep him dependent on them, and they constantly demanded my hard-earned savings to keep me subservient. They worshipped the aesthetic of wealth without ever understanding the discipline and intelligence required to actually build it. I decided right then that I would master the very thing they used to control us. I would amass a level of financial security that would make me entirely untouchable. They thought they had discarded a broken sickly liability at that hotel. They thought they had seen the last of me. They had no idea they had just unleashed a highly motivated financial predator. The old Jada was dead. The new Jada was going to own everything. The remaining months of my treatment were a blur of calculated exhaustion. I continued to show up for every single chemotherapy infusion and every grueling round of radiation with a completely different mindset. I was no longer a victim, waiting for a rescue boat that was never going to arrive. I was an architect, actively drawing up the blueprints for my new life while the poison did its work. I used the quiet hours in the hospital recliner to finalize the structural framework of my new independent wealth management agency. I researched licensing requirements, secured a small initial office space, and mapped out a highly aggressive client acquisition strategy. My physical body was at its absolute weakest, but my mind operated with the lethal precision of a sniper. 6 months after the wedding incident, I reached the finish line. I stood in the main hallway of the oncology ward, wearing a simple tailored suit. My hair had begun to grow back in a tight, soft layer of dark coils. The gray, sickly pallor had completely vanished from my skin, replaced by a warm, healthy glow. Nurse Jackson stood next to me, smiling so brightly there were tears in her eyes. I reached out and grabbed the braided rope attached to the heavy brass bell mounted on the hospital wall. Ringing the bell is a tradition for cancer patients who have completed their final treatment. I pulled that rope 3 times. The loud, clear chime echoed down the corridor, marking the official end of the darkest chapter of my life. My oncologist stepped out of her office and handed me my final scan results. Complete remission. There was no trace of the disease left in my body. I hugged Nurse Jackson, thanked the staff who had become my surrogate family, and walked out of those sliding glass doors for the last time. The moment I was physically cleared, I executed my business plan with zero hesitation. I walked into the corner office of the prestigious corporate wealth management firm where I had worked for years and handed my resignation letter to the senior partner. He was completely shocked. He tried to offer me a promotion and a significant salary increase to stay, but I politely declined. I told him I was no longer interested in building wealth for other people's companies. I was going to build my own. I funneled every ounce of the pain, the anger, and the profound betrayal I had experienced into pure, unadulterated ambition. The first year of running my own firm was grueling. I worked 80-hour weeks. I was the chief executive, the financial analyst, the marketing director, and the janitor. I spent my days taking meetings with prospective clients and my nights poring over market data until my vision blurred. But this kind of exhaustion was entirely different from the exhaustion of chemotherapy or the exhaustion of dealing with my toxic family. This exhaustion had a purpose. It was building a foundation of absolute security. My unique approach to financial planning quickly set me apart in the highly competitive Atlanta market. Because I had literally stared death in the face and had everything stripped away from me by the people who were supposed to protect me, I understood the concept of risk and asset protection on a deeply visceral level. I did not just talk to my clients about return on investment. I talked to them about bulletproofing their legacies. I talked to them about creating financial fortresses that no unexpected tragedy and no toxic family member could ever penetrate. High net worth clients resonated deeply with my fierce, uncompromising dedication. They trusted me because they could sense that I was utterly fearless. Within 2 years, my independent agency exploded into a massive success. We went from managing a few $1 million to overseeing hundreds of millions in assets. I hired a brilliant team of aggressive young analysts and seasoned portfolio managers. We moved out of the tiny rented office space and secured an entire floor in a sleek glass high-rise in the downtown financial district. My personal income skyrocketed from a comfortable 6 figures to a multi-million-dollar net worth. But I did not buy flashy sports cars or designer clothing covered in giant logos. I had seen my brother Jamal and my parents worship that kind of loud, fake wealth. I preferred quiet, immense power. The kind of wealth that does not need to scream for attention because it owns the entire building. With my business thriving and my physical health perfectly stable, I decided it was time to establish my permanent sanctuary. I sold the small townhouse I had lived in during my illness and began looking for a property that truly reflected the woman I had become. I found it in one of the most exclusive, highly secured suburbs of Atlanta. It was a breathtaking, ultra-modern architectural masterpiece. The house sat on 2 acres of pristine manicured land, hidden behind heavy iron privacy gates and a dense perimeter of tall evergreen trees. It featured massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, a sleek minimalist design, and a beautiful infinity pool in the backyard. The interior was a masterpiece of imported marble, warm hardwood floors, and state-of-the-art smart home technology. It was not just a house, it was a fortress. The day I closed on the property, I walked through the massive double front doors completely alone. The house was entirely empty, waiting for me to fill it with new memories. I stood in the center of the sprawling living room and listened to the profound absolute silence. There was no screaming. There were no frantic phone calls demanding money for a catering budget. There were no guilt trips about how I was not doing enough for my brother. There was only the gentle hum of the central air conditioning and the sunlight pouring across the marble floors. I had bought this multi-million-dollar property entirely in cash. No co-signers, no family money, no favors owed to anyone. I had literally paid for it with my own blood, sweat, and tears. I hired top-tier interior designers to furnish the home precisely to my taste. I filled it with beautiful original artwork, plush custom furniture, and a massive state-of-the-art kitchen. I created a dedicated guest suite that was far nicer than any hotel room my parents had ever stayed in. But that room was strictly reserved for the people who had actually earned the right to be in my life. The people who had held my hand when I was bald and vomiting, not the people who had pushed me away in a hotel hallway. Throughout this entire period of massive physical and financial resurrection, I never once looked back. The severance from my biological family remained absolute. I never unblocked their phone numbers. I never created a fake social media account to check on their lives. I never asked mutual acquaintances how they were doing. As far as I was concerned, Calvin, Brenda, Jamal, and Nia had ceased to exist the moment I drove out of that wedding venue parking lot. Some people might find that level of detachment cold or unnatural. Society constantly pushes the narrative that you must always forgive and reconcile with family because blood is thicker than water. But people who say that have never had their blood family leave them to die. Forgiveness does not require reconciliation. I forgave them in the sense that I completely released the heavy toxic anger I had been carrying. I no longer woke up furious at my mother. I no longer cried over my father's rejection. I simply felt nothing toward them. A deep, impenetrable apathy had taken the place of my childhood trauma. I was entirely self-made, physically healed, and financially bulletproof. I woke up every morning in my beautiful home, drove my luxury sedan to my corner office, and spent my days dominating the financial sector. I had built a new, chosen family of fiercely loyal friends, colleagues, and a wonderful, supportive partner who loved me for exactly who I was, not for what they could extract from me. My life was perfectly designed and entirely under my control. I had won the war. I had built an empire that my family could never touch. I was completely at peace. But the universe has a very specific sense of irony. Just when you think you have permanently closed the book on your past, the past suddenly goes bankrupt and comes desperately knocking on your heavy iron gates. The morning of my 35th birthday, I woke up before the sun. I did not wake up in a cold sweat or in agonizing pain. I woke up to the gentle hum of my smart home system slowly opening the motorized blackout shades in my master bedroom. The soft morning light spilled across the king-sized bed, illuminating the peaceful face of my partner Derek, who was still fast asleep beside me. I slipped out of bed, walked into my massive marble bathroom, and stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror. 3 years ago, on my 32nd birthday, I was completely bald. I weighed less than 110 pounds. My skin was gray, and my eyes were hollow with the sheer terror of facing stage 3 cancer entirely alone. I had spent that day violently throwing up in a plastic basin while my family ignored my existence to plan a luxury wedding. But the woman looking back at me in the mirror today was a completely different person. My hair had grown out into thick, healthy, natural curls that framed my face. My skin was glowing and my collarbones no longer jutted out from severe weight loss. I was strong. I was a multi-million-dollar agency owner. I was a survivor. Today was not just my 35th birthday. It was my official 3-year cancer-free milestone. It was a dual celebration of life and rebirth. Derek stirred in the bed and smiled at me through the mirror. He is a corporate attorney who understands the grueling demands of my industry, but more importantly, he understands the absolute necessity of my boundaries. When I told him early in our relationship that I had no contact with my biological family, he did not push. He did not offer toxic platitudes about forgiveness. He simply held my hand and told me that he would be my family now. And he kept that promise every single day. By 7 o'clock that evening, my ultra-modern townhouse was completely transformed. I had hired a premium catering company to set up a massive spread in my kitchen. There was a private chef carving prime rib, a sommelier pouring expensive vintage wines, and a jazz trio playing softly on the back patio by the infinity pool. The floor-to-ceiling glass doors were pushed open, letting the warm Atlanta evening breeze flow through the house. The people filling my living room were not tied to me by blood. They were tied to me by loyalty, by shared struggles, and by genuine unconditional love. This was my chosen family. Nurse Jackson was the first person to arrive. She walked through my massive double doors wearing a beautiful brightly colored dress, a huge smile on her face. When I saw her, I immediately walked past a group of wealthy clients and wrapped my arms around her. This was the woman who had held my hand while toxic chemicals burned through my veins. She had wiped my tears when my mother could not even be bothered to answer a text message. She looked around my luxurious home, her eyes wide with pride. She told me she always knew I was going to do something incredible with my second chance at life. My loyal friends from the financial sector were laughing by the pool. These were the colleagues who had sent me care packages when I was too weak to grocery shop. They were the people who had celebrated every single business milestone as I built my independent agency from the ground up. Derek moved effortlessly through the crowd, making sure everyone had a drink, pulling me into random embraces and kissing the top of my head. There was no tension in the air. There was no walking on eggshells. I did not have to worry about my mother making a passive-aggressive comment about my weight. I did not have to worry about my father demanding I pay for the catering bill. I did not have to watch my brother Jamal soak up all the attention while treating everyone else like background extras in the movie of his life. The contrast between this beautiful evening and the agonizing isolation of my past was staggering. True family is not an accident of biology. It is a conscious, deliberate choice. It is the people who actively choose to show up for you when you have absolutely nothing to offer them but your broken pieces. The people in my house that night had loved me when I was a bald, exhausted liability. Now they were getting to celebrate with me at the absolute height of my success. About midway through the party, the jazz band took a short break. I was standing near the kitchen island holding a crystal flute of sparkling apple cider because I still preferred to keep my body as healthy as possible. I was laughing at a joke Derek had just told when I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. I turned around and saw Miss Loretta. She was an older woman who used to attend the same church as my parents. She was always very sweet to me when I was a little girl, often sneaking me extra pieces of candy when my mother was not looking. She was one of the very few people from my past that I had not completely blocked, because she had actually reached out to me during my cancer treatments to pray for my healing. Miss Loretta gave me a warm hug and congratulated me on the beautiful home. She admired the marble countertops and the imported chandeliers, but I could see a deep hesitation in her eyes. She kept glancing around nervously, as if she was carrying a heavy secret and did not know where to put it down. I smiled and asked her if she was enjoying the food. She nodded slowly, holding her small plate of appetizers. She took a deep breath and lowered her voice, leaning in close so the other guests could not hear. "Jada, honey, I am so incredibly proud of you. Look at all this. Look at what you have built. You are glowing. But I feel like I need to tell you something. I know you do not speak to them anymore, and I respect that. But things are getting really bad for your family. Really bad." The music seemed to fade slightly into the background. I did not flinch. I did not drop my glass. I simply looked at her, maintaining a perfectly polite and neutral expression. I waited for her to continue. She shook her head, her eyes filled with pity. Not pity for me, but pity for them. "Jamal's latest tech business completely collapsed last month," she whispered. "He took out massive high-interest loans, and he lost every single penny. When the money dried up, Nia packed her bags and left him. She filed for divorce 2 weeks ago, and she is taking half of whatever is left. He is completely ruined, Jada." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling cider. The cold, crisp liquid washed over my tongue. I thought about the $10,000 catering budget. I thought about the imported orchids in the raw seafood bar. I thought about Nia standing in that hotel hallway telling me my cancer was ruining her aesthetic. The fact that her aesthetic had been funded by fraudulent loans and was now collapsing in divorce court was the pure definition of poetic justice. Miss Loretta leaned in even closer, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "But it gets worse, baby. Your parents co-signed on all of Jamal's business loans. They took out a second mortgage on their house to pay for that ridiculous wedding and to keep his lifestyle afloat. The bank has officially started foreclosure proceedings. Calvin and Brenda are going to lose the house. Jamal's cars have already been repossessed. They have absolutely nothing left. They are bankrupt, Jada." I stood there in the center of my multi-million-dollar fortress, listening to the complete destruction of the people who had left me to die. Society tells us that in moments like this, we are supposed to feel compassion. We are supposed to feel a sudden rush of familial loyalty and rush in to save them. I felt absolutely nothing. The empathy well had run completely dry 3 years ago in a hospital chemotherapy chair. They had dug their own graves with their greed, their arrogance, and their desperate need to maintain a fake image of wealth. They had sacrificed my life to fund a golden child who turned out to be a complete fraud. The universe was simply collecting the debt. I looked at Miss Loretta. I saw the expectation in her eyes. She was a good Christian woman who probably hoped that hearing this tragic news would soften my heart. She probably hoped the wealthy, successful daughter would step in, write a massive check, and rescue her fallen family. Instead, I offered her a serene, polite smile. I gently touched her arm and spoke in a clear, unwavering voice. "Miss Loretta, the prime rib is absolutely fantastic tonight. You really must try it before the chef packs up. And please make sure you take a slice of the red velvet cake. It is my absolute favorite." Her mouth opened slightly in shock. She stared at me, trying to find a trace of anger or sadness or vindictiveness in my expression. But there was none. I was entirely unbothered. I was so completely detached from their existence that the news of their financial ruin held the same emotional weight as hearing that it might rain tomorrow. Miss Loretta slowly closed her mouth, nodded in understanding, and patted my hand. She recognized the steel in my voice. She knew the conversation was over. I turned back to my party. I walked over to Derek, who immediately wrapped his arm around my waist and pulled me close. The jazz trio started playing a lively, upbeat tune. The room was filled with the sounds of clinking glasses and genuine, joyous laughter. I looked around at my chosen family, the people who had earned their place in my life, through unwavering loyalty and love. My biological family was currently sitting in the ruins of their own arrogance, terrified of the impending eviction. Meanwhile, I was standing in my own custom mansion, surrounded by love, celebrating the fact that I had conquered death. Karma is not always a swift hammer. Sometimes it is a slow, methodical dismantling of every toxic illusion a person has ever built. I finished my glass of cider and let the music wash over me. I was ready for whatever came next, because I knew with absolute certainty that the desperate knocking was about to begin. The Monday morning after my 35th birthday party, I drove to my office with a renewed sense of focus. The conversation with Miss Loretta had not ruined my weekend, but it had triggered my professional instincts. When you spend your entire career analyzing risk-managing assets and predicting market behavior, you learn that information is your greatest armor. I knew that my family being completely bankrupted was not just a piece of neighborhood gossip. It was a highly volatile situation that was inevitably going to crash into my carefully protected world. Desperate people do desperate things, and my family had a long documented history of viewing me as their personal emergency fund. I walked into my corner office, set my briefcase on the desk, and called my lead financial analyst into the room. I gave him the full legal names of my father Calvin, my mother Brenda, and my brother Jamal. I instructed him to run a comprehensive legal and financial background check using the public databases our firm utilizes for corporate due diligence. I wanted every public record, every court filing, every lien, and every judgment pulled and placed on my desk by noon. I did not do this out of familial concern. I did this the exact same way a general surveys a battlefield before the enemy has a chance to advance. At 12:15, exactly, a thick manila folder was placed on my desk. I closed my office door, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and opened the file. What I read over the next hour was a masterclass in financial self-destruction. It was the mathematical result of unchecked arrogance and pure narcissism. Let us start with the golden child. The documents painted a crystal-clear picture of Jamal's spectacular downfall. For years, he had played the role of the highly successful entrepreneur. His latest venture, the tech startup that supposedly required the extravagant lifestyle to attract high-level investors, was nothing more than a hollow shell. The business filings showed that instead of paying software developers or building an actual product, Jamal had funneled the startup capital directly into his personal lifestyle. He signed a commercial lease for a massive penthouse office space just so he could post photos of the skyline view on social media. He leased 2 brand-new luxury sports utility vehicles under the company name. He bought first-class tickets to Dubai and Paris to keep up his wife's aesthetic. But fake wealth requires real cash flow to sustain it. When the initial funding dried up and the investors realized there was no product, Jamal panicked. Instead of downsizing, he took out massive predatory commercial loans with exorbitant interest rates. He used the new loans to pay the old debts, creating a massive, unmanageable Ponzi scheme of his own life. Then came the inevitable crash. The creditors filed judgments. The commercial leases were terminated for non-payment. The luxury vehicles were repossessed by the bank in the middle of the night, leaving Jamal to wake up to an empty driveway. And then there was Nia, my beautiful, arrogant sister-in-law, who had stood in a hotel hallway and told me my cancer was ruining her wedding aesthetic. Nia was never in love with Jamal. She was in love with the delusion of high society that my parents had funded. The public divorce filings were absolutely brutal to read. The documents showed that the very second the bank froze their joint checking accounts, the illusion shattered. Nia did not stay to comfort her husband through his business failure. She did not offer to get a job to help pay the bills. Instead, she immediately hired one of the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the city. She filed for divorce, citing financial infidelity and reckless spending. Because she moved fast before the accounts were completely locked down by creditors, she managed to secure half of whatever liquid cash was remaining. She legally completely gutted him. She packed up all the designer bags my parents had bought for her, left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter, and moved out. Jamal was left entirely alone in a massive leased house, waiting for the final eviction notice, with absolutely no income and millions of dollars in corporate debt. But the real tragedy, the one that truly highlighted the sheer magnitude of their toxic dynamic, was the financial crater my parents had dug for themselves. As I flipped to the section of the file containing Calvin and Brenda's records, I actually had to set my coffee mug down. My parents had spent their entire adult lives pretending to be wealthy. They lived in a nice house in a good neighborhood, but they had never actually built sustainable wealth. To fund Jamal's $100,000 wedding, they had taken out a massive home equity line of credit against their house. They tapped into the equity they had spent 30 years building just to buy imported orchids and raw seafood bars to impress people who did not actually care about them. Then, when Jamal's business started bleeding cash, they did the absolute worst thing any person nearing retirement age could possibly do. They legally attached their own survival to his sinking ship. The public records showed that my father Calvin had personally co-signed the massive commercial loans for Jamal's business. When Jamal stopped making the payments, the creditors immediately went after the guarantors. My parents panicked. Instead of letting Jamal face the consequences of his actions, they tried to save him. My mother Brenda liquidated her entire retirement portfolio. She cashed out her pension, taking a massive tax penalty just to keep the commercial lenders at bay for a few more months. They bet their entire financial existence, their entire future on the golden child. But it was not enough. You cannot fill a bottomless pit. When the tech company officially went under, the lenders did not care about my mother's country club aesthetic or my father's pride. They wanted their money. Because the loans were cross-collateralized. My parents' house was the direct collateral for Jamal's failed business. The documents on my desk showed the complete devastating timeline. The initial default notices, the late fees stacking up into the tens of thousands of dollars, the desperate attempts to take out personal loans to cover the mortgage, and finally the official notice of foreclosure. Calvin and Brenda were completely wiped out. Their bank accounts were drained, their credit scores were destroyed. The bank was actively preparing to auction off the family home, the exact same home where I grew up, the exact same home where they constantly told me I was not good enough. The irony was thick and suffocating. They had drained my college funds when I was a teenager to pay for Jamal's mistakes. They had demanded my hard-earned savings to fund a wedding while I was sitting in a cancer ward fighting for my life. They had completely discarded me to protect an image of perfection. And now that image had burned to the ground, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the ashes of their own arrogance. They were staring down the barrel of homelessness in their late 60s. I could only imagine the sheer humiliation they were experiencing. Their wealthy friends from the country club had undoubtedly stopped returning their calls. The people who had attended that extravagant bridal shower, drinking expensive champagne on my parents' dime, were nowhere to be found now that the creditors were knocking on the door. I closed the manila folder and leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. As a financial professional, I had seen people lose money before. I had seen bad investments, market crashes, and unfortunate economic downturns. But this was entirely different. This was not a stroke of bad luck. This was the mathematical absolute result of their own actions. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I felt a profound sense of validation. The universe had balanced the scales with terrifying precision. I had lost my hair, my health, and my family, but I had rebuilt an empire. They had sacrificed their daughter for a fantasy, and now they were left with nothing. I picked up my desk phone and called my executive assistant, Monique, into the office. I handed her the thick file and instructed her to run it through the industrial shredder. I did not need to keep the documents. The data was already permanently memorized in my head. I did not need to dwell on their misery because I had my own massive firm to run. But I also understood human nature better than most. I knew that toxic people do not simply accept defeat and quietly fade away. When parasites run out of resources, they immediately begin looking for a new host to drain. I was the wealthiest, most successful person they shared biology with. The fact that they had abandoned me during chemotherapy would not stop them. In their twisted minds, they still believed I owed them my life. I looked at Monique and gave her a very specific set of instructions. I told her to alert the building security downstairs. I gave them explicit orders that under no circumstances were Calvin, Brenda, or Jamal allowed past the lobby doors. I updated the protocols for my incoming emails and phone calls. I fortified the walls of my castle. The house of cards had completely crumbled. The golden child was ruined, and the enablers were bankrupt. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and went back to work making millions. I was completely ready. It was only a matter of time before they realized I was their only way out. And I was going to enjoy watching them hit the solid steel wall of my boundaries. Word travels faster than light in Southern social circles, especially when it is fueled by church gossip and spectacular financial ruin. Miss Loretta meant well when she warned me about my parents' bankruptcy at my birthday party, but she was a talker. Within 48 hours, the news of my massive success, my multi-million-dollar townhouse, and my thriving corporate firm had completely saturated the grapevine and reached the desperate ears of my destitute family. I could only imagine the sheer shock that must have paralyzed my mother when she heard the details. The daughter they had completely written off as a bald, sickly liability was now living a life of unimaginable luxury while they were packing their fine china into cardboard boxes. Suddenly, the people who had left me to die alone in a chemotherapy chair experienced a miraculous and highly convenient revival of their familial love. The amnesia regarding their past cruelty was instantaneous. To them, I was no longer the disappointing scapegoat. I was their personal lottery ticket out of poverty. The digital assault began on a Wednesday afternoon. My smartphone, which had been peacefully silent from their toxic drama for 3 years, suddenly began logging dozens of blocked call attempts. They started with their own personal cell phones. When those calls did not go through, they tried calling from landlines. They tried using Jamal's burner business phones. But I had long ago configured my personal device to automatically reject any incoming call from a number not saved in my approved contacts list. They were throwing themselves against a solid steel wall. My phone never even rang. When they realized the phone calls were useless, they quickly pivoted to email. They assumed my professional business address would be vulnerable and public-facing. What they did not understand was the sheer efficiency of a highly paid corporate executive assistant. Monique was not just a secretary to me. She was the absolute gatekeeper to my empire. I had given Monique the strict parameters years ago. Any communication containing the names Calvin, Brenda, or Jamal was to be immediately intercepted. One afternoon, Monique walked into my corner office holding a printed sheet of paper with a look of absolute disgust on her face. She told me she had intercepted a massive email from my mother and asked if I wanted to read it for legal documentation purposes, in case we needed to file a harassment restraining order. I took the paper from her hand and read the text. The email was a masterpiece of gaslighting and manipulation. It began with my mother calling me her precious darling daughter. It went on to describe the terrible financial hardships they were facing, blaming the entire situation on a bad economy, and ruthless bankers completely omitting Jamal's fraudulent business practices. My mother wrote paragraph after paragraph about how much she missed me, and how she had been praying for my success every single day. There was absolutely no apology for abandoning me at the hospital. There was no mention of my cancer or the fact that she had physically shoved me in a hotel hallway. The email concluded with a bold, staggering demand. She told me to wire them $50,000 immediately to stall the bank foreclosure out of my Christian duty and family loyalty. She even included a routing number at the bottom of the page. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel angry. I felt a profound, cold amusement at their sheer audacity. I handed the paper back to Monique and told her to drop it directly into the industrial shredder. I instructed her to permanently route their entire email domain to the spam folder. They were shouting into a digital void, and I was not going to give them the satisfaction of an echo. But desperation is a very dangerous catalyst. When toxic, manipulative people realize they are being completely ignored, their panic quickly turns into aggressive entitlement. By Friday morning, my family realized that digital communication was a dead end. They needed a physical confrontation. They needed to corner me and put me on the spot in front of an audience where they assumed my professional reputation would force me to comply with their demands. However, my parents were far too cowardly to face me themselves just yet. They knew deep down what they had done to me, and they were afraid of my reaction. So they decided to deploy a proxy to test the waters. They sent my Aunt Maxine. Maxine was my mother's older sister, and she was notorious in our family for her loud, dramatic outbursts. She thrived on causing scenes and demanding compliance through sheer volume. She was the perfect flying monkey for my parents' manipulative agenda. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I was in the middle of a high-level financial strategy meeting with my senior portfolio managers in the glass-walled conference room. We were discussing the acquisition of distressed commercial assets. Suddenly, Monique stepped into the room, interrupting the presentation. Her face was completely serious, and her jaw was tight. She walked over to my chair and leaned down, whispering that there was a situation in the main reception lobby. A woman claiming to be my aunt had bypassed the ground floor security by lying about having an appointment. She was currently refusing to leave my floor and was starting to raise her voice at the front desk staff, causing a scene in front of our clients. I calmly excused myself from the meeting. I did not feel nervous or flustered. I felt a cold, calculating calm settle over my entire body. I walked down the long, thickly carpeted hallway toward the reception lobby. Through the heavy frosted glass doors, I could hear Aunt Maxine's shrill voice echoing off the expensive marble walls. She was pointing a finger at my young receptionist, demanding to be let into my private office. She was shouting about how disrespectful it was for a young corporate girl to keep family waiting in a lobby. I pushed open the glass doors and stepped into the room. My presence immediately silenced the entire space. I was wearing a sharp, tailored designer suit, my posture perfectly straight, projecting absolute, unyielding authority. Aunt Maxine slowly turned to look at me. For a split second, a look of genuine shock crossed her face. She had not seen me since I was a bald, fragile cancer patient trying to survive the winter. Now she was looking at a powerful multimillionaire standing in the center of her own corporate headquarters. But her shock quickly morphed back into manufactured outrage. She assumed she still held the authority of an elder. "Jada," she gasped, pressing a hand to her chest in a theatrical display of emotion. "Look at you, acting like you are too important to speak to your own blood. Your mother is completely heartbroken. Your father is literally losing his home. And you are sitting up here in this glass tower ignoring their calls. Have you lost your mind entirely? Where is your family loyalty?" I stopped about 6 feet away from her, maintaining a professional and highly intimidating physical distance. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her frantic energy. I spoke with the calm, measured tone of a chief executive addressing a severe liability. "Family loyalty." "Aunt Maxine," I asked softly. "That is a fascinating concept. Tell me exactly, where was this family loyalty 3 years ago when I was sitting in an oncology ward violently vomiting from chemotherapy? Where was this beautiful loyalty when Brenda physically shoved me in a hotel hallway because my bald head ruined the aesthetic of Jamal's luxury wedding? Where were all of you when I was fighting for my absolute life entirely alone?" Maxine stammered, stepping back slightly. Her face flushed a deep shade of crimson as the receptionist and several clients in the waiting area watched her with wide eyes. She tried to pivot back to the guilt trip, raising her voice to compensate for her lack of leverage. "That is in the past, Jada. You survived, but your parents are about to be homeless out on the street. You have more money than you could ever spend in a lifetime. It is your absolute duty as a daughter to help them out of this crisis. God commands you to honor your mother and father. You cannot just abandon them when they need you the most." I looked her dead in the eye and let the temperature of my voice drop to freezing. I honored them by removing my toxic presence from their perfect lives, I replied smoothly. They made their financial investment in Jamal. They bet their entire retirement and their home on his delusions. And now they are reaping the exact dividends of that terrible choice. My wealth management firm does not operate as a charity for people who left me for dead. Maxine opened her mouth to scream another insult, but I did not give her the floor. I turned my head and nodded at the two large building security guards who had already quietly positioned themselves near the elevators at Monique's request. Gentlemen, please escort this woman out of my building. If she or anyone else claiming to be from my biological family attempts to enter this premises again, you are authorized to involve law enforcement and press trespassing charges immediately. I want their photos distributed to the ground floor security desk within the hour. Aunt Maxine began to yell wildly, calling me cold, heartless, and evil. She screamed that I was going to burn in hell for turning my back on my own mother. She flailed her arms as the security guards firmly grasped her elbows and guided her toward the elevator banks. I did not even stay to watch the doors close on her flushed, angry face. I simply turned around, walked back through the frosted glass doors, and returned to my strategy meeting. I sat back down at the head of the long conference table and picked up my pen. My senior analysts were looking at me with a mixture of sheer awe and slight intimidation. The entire interruption had taken less than 4 minutes. I offered them a polite professional smile and instructed them to continue the presentation on the distressed asset acquisitions. The brief encounter with Aunt Maxine confirmed exactly what I had suspected. My family was completely unhinged by their financial ruin, and they were not going to stop trying to breach my walls. My parents were cowards for sending her first, but her utter failure would only force them into much more desperate and public measures. They actually believed they could shame me into submission. They thought my corporate success made me a soft, easy target, worried about public relations. They still did not understand that the chemotherapy had burned away every single ounce of my compliance. They had built their entire lives on a fragile house of cards, and now they were furiously trying to drag me into the wreckage to cushion their fall. But I was not just standing safely on the outside of their destruction watching them drown. I was actively holding the deed to the ocean. The desperate reach had failed, and now it was time for me to spring the trap. The morning after Aunt Maxine was forcibly removed from my lobby, I arrived at my office before the sun even came up. The sprawling Atlanta skyline was still painted in deep shades of indigo and violet. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city. My aunt making a public scene was just the opening move in what was guaranteed to be a highly aggressive campaign. Toxic people do not retreat when their initial manipulation fails. They regroup and they escalate. I knew my parents and my brother were currently sitting in their crumbling financial reality, plotting their next desperate attempt to force my hand. They believed they could corner me. They believed that because we shared biology, I was inherently vulnerable to their pressure. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the arena we were operating in. They thought we were having a family dispute. I was executing a corporate takeover. In the high-stakes world of wealth management, there is a highly specialized sector dedicated to distressed assets. When individuals or corporations default on their massive loans, the lending banks eventually write off those losses. To recoup a fraction of their money, the banks bundle these bad loans together and sell them in massive portfolios to private equity firms and specialized wealth management agencies. They sell this debt for pennies on the dollar. The firm that buys the portfolio then assumes the legal right to collect the full debt, restructure it, or enforce the liquidation of the collateral assets. Over the past 2 years, my agency had aggressively expanded into this exact sector. We had a dedicated division of legal and financial sharks who hunted for lucrative, distressed commercial paper. We bought debt, we enforced the collections, and we generated massive returns for our high-net-worth clients. I was a financial planner by trade, but I had evolved into an apex predator in the corporate debt market. I walked away from the window, sat down at my massive mahogany desk, and pressed the intercom button. I asked my lead corporate attorney Lawrence to come into my office immediately. Lawrence was a brilliant, ruthless lawyer who specialized in aggressive corporate acquisitions. He did not care about family drama. He only cared about legally ironclad contracts and absolute leverage. When Lawrence walked in and took a seat across from me, I handed him a single sheet of paper. On it were the full legal names of my father Calvin, my mother Brenda, and my brother Jamal. Below their names were the specific addresses of my parents' house and the commercial office spaces Jamal had leased. I looked at Lawrence and gave him a very specific and highly confidential directive. I told him to contact the local commercial banks that held the defaulted loans for my brother and the foreclosed mortgage for my parents. I told him I did not care if those specific loans were bundled with 50 other bad commercial mortgages. I wanted my firm to purchase the entire portfolio. I wanted the legal assignment of their debt transferred completely and exclusively to my holding company. Lawrence looked at the paper and then looked up at me. He did not ask any personal questions. He did not need to know why the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar firm was suddenly hyper-focused on a specific residential foreclosure in the suburbs. He recognized the tone in my voice. He simply nodded, placed the paper in his leather folio, and told me he would have the initial acquisition contracts drafted by the end of the day. To ensure the transaction remained completely invisible to my family, we executed the purchase through a subsidiary shell company. I named the blind trust Phoenix Capital Holdings. It was a quiet nod to the fact that I had burned to the ground and risen from my own ashes while they were busy celebrating a wedding. Through Phoenix Capital, I authorized the transfer of millions of dollars in liquid capital to purchase the massive debt portfolios from their panicked lenders. The banks were absolutely thrilled to offload the toxic assets. Jamal's commercial loans were a complete mess of high-interest penalties, and my parents' cross-collateralized mortgage was a legal nightmare that the original bank did not want to spend months litigating. They gladly took my money and signed over the complete legal rights to the debt. The entire acquisition process took less than 2 weeks. It was a masterpiece of silent, lethal corporate strategy. While my parents were frantically calling my blocked phone number and sending flying monkeys to my office lobby, I was quietly buying the very ground beneath their feet. When the final paperwork was complete, Lawrence walked back into my office and placed a thick, pristine manila folder directly in the center of my desk. He informed me that the assignment of mortgage had been legally recorded with the county clerk's office. The commercial liens on Jamal's repossessed assets and the outstanding judgments were now the exclusive property of our firm. I thanked Lawrence and waited for him to close the door behind him. I sat alone in my quiet office and placed my hands flat on top of the manila folder. Inside that folder was the deed of trust to my childhood home. The 4-bedroom house with the manicured lawn, where I was constantly told I was not good enough. The house where my mother had demanded I empty my savings account for a catering budget. The house where my father had sighed in annoyance when I told him I had stage 3 cancer. I opened the folder and looked at the official legal documents. My firm was now listed as the primary creditor. I did not just know they were bankrupt. I literally owned their bankruptcy. I was the bank. I was the landlord. I held the absolute legal authority to order the county sheriff to change the locks on their front door and set their belongings on the curb. A profound shift occurred in the universe at that exact moment. For 32 years, the power dynamic in my family had been entirely one-sided. They held all the authority, and I carried all the obligation. They used financial manipulation to keep me small, terrified, and desperate for their approval. Now the scales had not just been balanced, they had been entirely obliterated. I held their complete financial ruin in the palm of my hand. But I had no intention of calling them to gloat. I was not going to send an email announcing my new legal status. The element of absolute surprise was the final necessary component of this surgical strike. I needed them to walk directly into the trap under the delusion that they were still in control. I picked up my desk phone and called Monique. I gave her a new set of instructions. I told her that when Calvin, Brenda, or Jamal inevitably showed up at the building, they were no longer to be immediately escorted off the premises by security. Instead, security was to allow them to wait on the public sidewalk, just outside the main glass doors of the high-rise. I told Monique to monitor the security cameras and alert me the absolute second they arrived. Then I called Lawrence back into my office. I instructed his legal team to draft the official final notices of eviction and the demand letters for the immediate repayment of Jamal's commercial debt. I wanted the documents formatted perfectly. I wanted the exact total of their outstanding liabilities printed in bold black ink. And most importantly, I wanted every single document printed on the official heavy stock letterhead of my wealth management firm. I wanted my corporate logo and my name right at the top of their destruction. Lawrence had the documents drafted and printed within the hour. I took the crisp professional papers and slid them into a slim designer leather portfolio. I placed the portfolio inside my briefcase and snapped the golden clasps shut. I was completely ready. I went about my daily business, taking meetings, reviewing quarterly earnings, and managing my clients' portfolios with the calm, steady focus of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to fear. I drove home to my beautiful, ultra-modern fortress, every evening slept perfectly soundly next to my partner Derek, and woke up energized. I knew they were running out of time. The original bank had given them a 30-day notice to vacate before I purchased the debt. The calendar was ruthlessly ticking down. The desperation was going to hit a boiling point. They had exhausted their phone calls, their emails, and their extended family members. They were out of money, they were out of options, and they were completely out of time. I knew exactly what they were going to do. They were going to try to ambush me. They were going to come to my professional sanctuary and attempt to drag me back into the gutter with them. They were going to try to use public humiliation and fake tears to force me to open my checkbook. I kept my briefcase by my side all week. Every time I walked out of the building for a lunch meeting or stepped onto the pavement to wait for my valet, I was ready. I was holding the ultimate trump card. The trap was perfectly set. The steel jaws were wide open, and I was just waiting for the golden child and his enablers to step right into it. The inevitable confrontation finally occurred on a crisp Thursday afternoon. I was scheduled to have a late lunch with a prospective client at a high-end restaurant just 2 blocks down the street from my corporate headquarters. I walked out of the heavy glass doors of my building accompanied by my lead corporate attorney Lawrence and stepped onto the bustling downtown sidewalk. The street was crowded with executives grabbing coffee and business professionals hurrying back to their offices. It was the absolute worst place to cause a public scene, which meant it was the exact place my family would choose to strike. As I turned toward the crosswalk, 2 figures suddenly stepped out from behind a large concrete planter and aggressively blocked my path. It was my brother Jamal and my father Calvin. I stopped walking. Lawrence immediately stepped slightly in front of me, his protective instincts kicking in. But I held up my hand and gently signaled him to step back. I had been waiting for this exact moment. I looked at my brother. Jamal did not look like the arrogant golden child who had demanded a $10,000 raw seafood bar 3 years ago. The stress of his fraudulent business collapsing and his wife divorcing him had taken a severe physical toll. He looked disheveled. His designer suit was wrinkled and hanging loosely on his frame. The smug superiority that used to permanently rest on his face was entirely gone, replaced by a frantic, desperate energy. Right next to him, my father Calvin immediately launched into a theatrical performance that belonged on a television screen. The second he made eye contact with me, Calvin let out a loud, wailing sob. He literally dropped to his knees on the hard concrete sidewalk, clutching his chest as if he were having a medical emergency. He began crying loudly, shouting my name and begging me to look at him. The loud cries instantly drew the attention of the crowded street. Dozens of pedestrians stopped walking. People walking out of my building, including several of my own employees, paused to watch the spectacle unfold. My father was loudly sobbing about how sick he was and how his own daughter was leaving him to die on the street. Jamal took this as his cue to escalate the ambush. He stepped closer to me, pointing a shaking finger directly in my face. His voice was incredibly loud, echoing off the surrounding glass buildings. "You should be ashamed of yourself, Jada," he screamed. "You are a multimillionaire, and you are letting your elderly parents get thrown out of their home. You sit up in your fancy corner office while your own blood is starving. We are taking you to court. I have already spoken to a lawyer and we are suing you for elder abandonment. We are going to call the local news stations and tell everyone in this city exactly what kind of monster runs your wealth management firm." He was trying to leverage my professional reputation against me. He assumed that because I was a chief executive officer, I would be terrified of bad public relations. He thought that if he caused a massive scene in front of my colleagues and clients, I would panic. He fully expected me to grab him by the arm, usher him into a private room, and write him a massive check just to make the embarrassment go away. He looked around at the gathering crowd with a smug look of triumph on his face. He actually thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted me. I stood completely still on the sidewalk. I did not yell back. I did not try to defend my character to the strangers watching us. I did not tell the crowd that these were the same men who left me to die of stage 3 cancer. Explaining myself would mean I cared about their opinions, and I was completely beyond caring. Instead, I looked down at my father, who was still kneeling on the concrete, squeezing his eyes shut to force out fake tears. Then I looked at my brother, who was breathing heavily and glaring at me with a desperate, entitled rage. "Are you quite finished, Jamal?" I asked. My voice was incredibly calm and quiet, forcing him to stop yelling just to hear me. Jamal scoffed and crossed his arms over his chest. "Not even close, Jada. You are going to pay off Mom and Dad's mortgage today, and you are going to cover my legal fees for the divorce. If you do not wire the money by the end of the day, I am going straight to the press. You owe us." I did not flinch. I did not argue. I simply walked over to the flat edge of the concrete planter and set my designer leather briefcase down. I unfastened the golden clasps with a sharp, satisfying click. I opened the lid, reached inside, and pulled out the pristine, thick manila folder I had been carrying with me all week. I closed the briefcase, picked up the folder, and walked back over to Jamal. I held the heavy stack of documents out toward him. Jamal looked at the folder. A sudden flash of greedy relief washed over his face. He actually thought I was handing him a settlement agreement. He thought I had crumbled under the pressure of the public ambush and prepared the financial rescue package he was demanding. He snatched the folder out of my hand with a triumphant smirk and flipped it open. I stood perfectly still and watched the exact moment his entire reality shattered. Jamal looked at the top page. It was the official notice of foreclosure for my parents' house. He frowned in confusion, quickly flipping to the next page. That document was the commercial demand letter for the millions of dollars in defaulted loans connected to his ruined tech startup. But what completely destroyed him was not the legal text. It was the logo printed at the absolute top of every single page. It was the official heavy stock letterhead of my wealth management firm. I watched the blood completely drain from Jamal's face. His skin turned a pale, sickly gray. His hands began to shake violently, causing the thick stack of papers to rattle. His eyes darted frantically from the logo on the paper to my face and back again. His mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. I took a slow step forward, closing the physical distance between us until I was looking directly into his terrified eyes. I kept my voice perfectly measured, carrying just enough volume for my brother and my father to hear every single devastating syllable. "You thought you were coming here to extort your estranged sister, Jamal," I said smoothly. "You thought you could stand on a public sidewalk and threaten a corporate executive with bad press to get a free handout. But you fundamentally misunderstood the situation." Jamal swallowed hard, gripping the folder so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "How do you have these files?" "I bought them," I replied. "My firm recently acquired a massive portfolio of distressed commercial and residential debt from your local lenders. The holding company listed on those foreclosure notices is a direct subsidiary of my agency." I do not just know that you are completely bankrupt, Jamal. I own your bankruptcy. Calvin, who had been pretending to weep on the sidewalk, suddenly stopped making noise. The theatrical performance abruptly ended. He slowly pushed himself up off the concrete, his eyes wide with genuine sheer terror as he realized what I was saying. I turned my attention to my father. You are not facing a faceless bank anymore, Calvin. You are facing me. I hold the deed of trust to your house. I hold the commercial liens on every single asset Jamal has left to his name. My legal team drafted those eviction notices, and my firm is the entity actively enforcing them. I am your primary creditor. Jamal started backing away, shaking his head in absolute denial. You cannot do this, he stammered. That is illegal. You are our family. You cannot foreclose on your own parents. I looked at him with eyes as cold as the chemotherapy room where he had abandoned me. It is entirely legal, Jamal. It is a standard corporate acquisition. And as for family, you made it abundantly clear 3 years ago that I was not a part of yours. You chose your luxury wedding over my life. You bet everything on a fraudulent aesthetic, and you lost. I am simply the bank collecting the outstanding debt. The dynamic on the street had completely inverted. The gathered crowd began to disperse, realizing this was not a tragic scene of elder abuse, but a highly complex corporate execution. Jamal and Calvin were no longer the loud, demanding victims. They looked like terrified children standing before a judge who had just handed down a life sentence. Jamal's smugness had entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the pathetic reality of his own failures. He realized in that moment that he had absolutely zero leverage. He could not run to the press and tell them his sister was foreclosing on him without exposing the fact that he was a massive fraud who had bankrupted his own parents. He was completely trapped in a cage of his own making, and I held the only key. My father, Calvin, began to physically tremble. This time, it was not a theatrical performance. It was the biological response to absolute ruin. He took a stumbling step toward me, reaching out with a shaking hand. Jada, please, he begged, his voice nothing more than a ragged whisper. We are sorry. We are so sorry for everything. Please do not take our home. Where will we go? We have absolutely nothing left. You have so much money. You cannot just throw us out onto the street. I looked at the hand reaching out toward me. The same hand that had held the telephone receiver when he told me my cancer was too inconvenient to deal with. The same man who had enabled my brother to drain my college funds and demand my life savings. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the urge to rescue him. The surgical extraction of my empathy was an absolute success. I looked at Calvin, and then I looked at Jamal. You have exactly 14 days to vacate the premises, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. If you are not completely moved out of the property by the date printed on those documents, my legal team will dispatch the county sheriff to physically remove you and change the locks. Do not attempt to contact my office again. Do not ever approach me on the street again. If you do, I will have you arrested for harassment. I turned around, picked up my designer briefcase from the concrete planter, and signaled to Lawrence that we were ready to leave. I did not wait for their response. I did not look back to see them standing frozen on the sidewalk, holding the legal documents that sealed their absolute destruction. I simply walked down the street toward my lunch meeting, my posture perfectly straight, my mind entirely at peace. I had barely taken 3 steps down the concrete pavement when the reality of the situation finally shattered the last remaining wall of my father's pride. I heard the sharp, frantic scuff of his leather shoes scraping against the sidewalk behind me. He did not just stand there and watch me leave. The sudden, absolute certainty that he was about to lose everything he had ever valued stripped away his dignity entirely. Jada, wait. His voice was a raw, desperate shriek that tore through the ambient noise of the busy city street. He lunged forward, and his trembling hand clamped down hard on the sleeve of my tailored wool coat. Lawrence, my corporate attorney, immediately stepped between us, moving with the swift protective instinct of a bodyguard. He grabbed my father's wrist firmly and pried his fingers off my clothing, warning him to step back immediately or face assault charges. But I raised my hand and gently placed it on Lawrence's arm, signaling him to stand down. I wanted to hear this. I wanted to witness the exact moment the man who had discarded me finally understood the true cost of his arrogance. Calvin stumbled backward slightly, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The heavy manila folder slipped from his grasp, hitting the ground and scattering the pristine legal documents across the dirty concrete. He did not even try to pick them up. He looked at Jamal, who was standing entirely frozen a few feet away, staring blankly at the eviction notices on the ground like a completely broken man. Jamal had nothing left to offer. The golden child was entirely bankrupt, and my father finally recognized that the incredibly expensive horse he had bet his entire life on had just died on the track. Calvin dropped to his knees right there in the middle of the sidewalk. The theatrical performance from 5 minutes ago was gone. This was pure, unadulterated terror. Tears streamed down his wrinkled face, dripping off his chin and staining his shirt collar. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and frantic, pleading with a desperation I had never seen from him before. "You cannot do this to us, Jada." He sobbed, his voice cracking under the weight of his panic. "We are your family. We are your blood. I am an old man. Your mother is sick with stress. We gave up everything for Jamal, and he lost it all. We have no savings left. We have no retirement. All of our friends from the club have stopped answering our phone calls. If you take the house, we will be out on the street. We will have absolutely nowhere to go." I looked down at him. I studied the deep lines on his face and the pathetic slump of his shoulders. I searched my own heart, looking for even the tiniest spark of pity or familial obligation. I searched for the little girl who used to beg for his attention. But that little girl was gone. She had been burned away by toxic chemotherapy chemicals and the freezing cold realization of their betrayal. The emotional void inside me was absolute, and it was incredibly peaceful. Calvin reached out a shaking hand, stopping just inches from my shoes, terrified to touch me again, but desperate for a lifeline. "Who is going to take care of me?" he cried out, the tears flowing freely now. "Jada, please, you have so much. You can save us. Please, look at me. I am your father." The busy street around us had gone completely quiet. The pedestrians who had lingered to watch the spectacle held their breath, waiting to see if the wealthy corporate executive would break down and forgive her weeping father. Society conditions us to believe that blood always wins. They expected a tearful reunion. They expected me to reach down, pull him to his feet, and tell him everything would be okay. I did not move a single muscle. I looked straight into the eyes of the man who had sighed in severe annoyance when I told him I had stage 3 breast cancer. I looked at the man who had allowed my mother to physically shove me in a hotel hallway. I leaned in slightly, closing the physical distance between my face and his. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my voice completely steady. The temperature of my words was absolute ice. "I died 3 years ago, Dad." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. The breath rushed out of his lungs in a sharp, agonizing gasp. His jaw trembled and his eyes widened as the sheer finality of my statement crashed over him. He knew exactly what I meant. He remembered the phone call. He remembered the hospital. He remembered the exact moment he chose to let me die. And he realized right then that there was absolutely no coming back from it. I did not wait for him to formulate an apology. I did not wait for him to scream or beg or negotiate. I simply turned on my heel, the sharp click of my designer shoes echoing on the pavement, and walked away. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the luxury restaurant down the street with Lawrence right beside me. We sat down at a quiet corner table, ordered an expensive bottle of sparkling water, and proceeded to close a massive corporate acquisition over lunch. I never looked out the window. I never looked back at the sidewalk. The following 14 days passed with the quiet mechanical efficiency of a well-oiled corporate machine. I did not receive any more phone calls. I did not receive any more emails. The absolute devastating reality of their situation had finally silenced them. They knew I was not making an idle threat. They knew I held the deed, and they knew I had the legal power to destroy them. On the morning of the 15th day, I was sitting in my corner office reviewing a quarterly earnings report when Monique walked in. She did not say a word. She simply placed a standard legal confirmation receipt on my desk and walked back out. I picked up the paper. It was the official execution report from the county sheriff's department. At exactly 8 o'clock that morning, 2 marked police cruisers had pulled up to my childhood home. The deputies knocked on the front door, presented the final eviction order, and gave Calvin and Brenda exactly 30 minutes to gather whatever personal belongings they could fit into their car. When the 30 minutes were up, they were escorted off the property. A professional locksmith hired by my firm immediately changed every single lock on the doors and windows. A heavy metal chain was secured across the driveway. They were officially locked out. The house now belonged entirely to Phoenix Capital Holdings. The financial fallout for my family was absolute and completely irreversible. Through the corporate grapevine and public records, I learned exactly where the Golden Child and his enablers ended up. Jamal, completely stripped of his assets and drowning in millions of dollars of corporate debt, filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. He was forced to move into a cheap weekly motel on the outskirts of the city. He took a minimum wage job working the night shift at a logistics warehouse just to afford his cheap rent and basic groceries. The man who had demanded a $10,000 raw seafood bar was now sweeping concrete floors in the middle of the night. Calvin and Brenda, having lost their home and their entire retirement portfolio, were forced to rely solely on their meager Social Security checks. They could not afford to stay in their affluent Boston suburb. They moved into a tiny, cramped, one-bedroom apartment in a low-income housing complex 2 towns over. Their country club friends completely abandoned them. The extended family members who had cheered for them at the luxury bridal shower suddenly stopped answering their calls when they asked to borrow money for groceries. They were completely isolated, left to spend the rest of their lives sitting in a tiny living room, blaming each other for their spectacular ruin. As for the house, my firm treated it like any other distressed asset. We hired a team of high-end contractors to go in and completely renovate the property. We ripped out the pale blue carpet in my old bedroom. We tore down the floral wallpaper my mother loved so much. We modernized the kitchen, updated the landscaping, and completely erased every single trace of their existence from the property. 2 months later, we put the house back on the market. It sold in less than a week for a massive cash profit. The money went directly into my firm's investment portfolio, growing my wealth even further. I never felt a single moment of guilt. I never woke up in the middle of the night, wondering if I had been too harsh. The destruction of their lives was not an act of vengeance. It was simply the natural consequence of their own toxic choices. They had planted seeds of extreme selfishness, arrogance, and cruelty for decades. I just happened to be the one who owned the land when the harvest finally came due. I sit here today in the center of my beautiful sunlit living room, looking out over my pristine infinity pool. The air in my home is quiet and perfectly still. My partner Derek is in the kitchen cooking dinner, and I can hear the faint sound of his laughter mixed with the soft jazz playing on our sound system. Later tonight, Nurse Jackson and a few of my closest friends are coming over to celebrate the closing of another massive corporate deal. My life is filled with genuine warmth, absolute security, and unconditional love. I survived the cancer that tried to destroy my body, and I survived the family that tried to destroy my spirit. I walked through the absolute darkest fires of betrayal and emerged with an empire. Sometimes the only way to cure a toxic family is to completely cut out the tumor. You cannot heal in the same environment that is actively making you sick. You cannot negotiate with people who view your boundaries as a personal insult and your success as a communal resource. If you are constantly setting yourself on fire just to keep your family warm, eventually you will burn to ashes and they will simply complain about the cold. Have you ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to protect you just to save yourself? Have you ever had to build your own table because you were denied a seat at theirs? Tell me your story in the comments below. Let this be a safe space for those of us who had to become the villains in our family's narrative just to become the heroes of our own lives. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that true family is built on respect and unconditional love, not manipulation and obligation. And always remember, your peace is worth more than their approval. Your future is far too valuable to be held hostage by people who only love you when you are convenient. Protect your peace, build your empire, and never apologize for surviving.